Hey, Laura, at the United States Naval Academy, they have a name for this time of year. A name besides January.
Oh, that was going to be my guess.
They call it the Dark Ages. Hello again, I'm Mark Huffman in the United States.
And I'm Laura McKeever in the United Kingdom, and this is RX411, your prescription for health.
With science-based health news and information from both sides of the Atlantic, direct from RX411.com. And the midshipmen at the Naval Academy, well, they face a pretty grueling existence most of the year, but they say it just seems tougher in the dead of winter.
Well, I'm not that familiar with what goes on at a military academy, but January can be a tough time for just about everyone.
Yeah, it's cold, it's dark, and it's just not that much fun. And I would imagine that if you were at risk of being depressed, this time of year is when that risk would be greatest.
Yeah, of course. And the winter is the time of year when the risk of depression and, incidents such as suicide does seem to grow stronger. And January is when we start to see the peak that takes people through to the spring. One of the biggest problems with that is around Christmas time and New Year, the media tends to focus on something called the Christmas suicide myth. And we're not really sure where this myth came from, but it's constantly being perpetuated, this idea that people are more likely to kill themselves and become severely depressed around the Christmas period. The Centre for Disease Control in the United States tries to fight against this because when people are putting all this emphasis on Christmas being the problem, they sort of forget that January is the actual issue, and people who are quite vulnerable are then left alone without support and treatment.
And I've heard you mention something called the triangle of risk, and that sounds kind of scary, kind of like the Bermuda Triangle. How scary is it?
It's, it can be fairly scary. It can also be quite helpful. So the triangle of risk is something we use in healthcare. It's a bit like the triangle of fire, the risk with that. And it basically discusses protective factors and risk factors. So if somebody who is depressed doesn't have a protective factor in the form of something that's stopping them from wanting to hurt themselves, such as their family, that's a risk. If they have access to the means to hurt themselves, such as a firearm or certain tablets, that's a risk. And if they have a solid plan to hurt themselves, that's also a risk. Much like the triangle of fire, if you remove one of those risks, the other two are no longer as risky. So for friends and family, it could be sort of helpful for people to look out for the triangle of risk.
The days are, shorter this time of year. It gets dark earlier. It gets light later in the morning. Does darkness have anything to do with depression?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of support for the idea that darkness can increase somebody's risk of depression. And like many areas of medicine, we don't quite have a solid link, but we do have a few studies that point us in the right direction. So say, for example, in the Nordic countries where there are long sort of periods, months on end, where it tends to be mostly dark and maybe only a couple of hours of sunlight, suicide and depression, the statistics just rise in terms of incidence, and then they come back down again in the summer when it gets lighter. And you may have heard the phrase seasonal affective disorder. So when, things aren't as sunny, and vitamin D also plays a role in people's mental health, depression does become more prevalent.
Now, if you know someone, a friend or family member, and you're worried about them, and I'm guessing this can be kind of tricky, is there something you can do, and what should you do?
So I think the first thing that you should do is enter into sort of any discussion either with them or a medical professional with a completely open mind. Practice a little bit of self-care yourself, but also look at that triangle of risk and perhaps appraise where that person is at in terms of their condition. It's a good idea to go and offer them support, but if you feel as though they're, an immediate risk to themselves, we always advise over here, and I'm not sure what you guys do, but you can call for an ambulance, you can sort of approach a medical professional on that person's behalf. And also there are certain agencies you can go to for support, such as the National Suicide Prevention Prevention Lifeline. You can hand that information to people, but you can also get support as a friend or family member for what you should do next.
And if you recognize yourself in the people that we've been talking about, I would imagine a little self-awareness would be helpful. Beyond that, how does a person get back on track?
So I would always advise that you go and speak to a medical professional such as your GP or your family doctor, somebody who can make an appropriate referral. I think the statistics in the United States are more than 50% who have a mental health condition haven't, received any treatment in the last year or so, which sort of suggests to me that there are people who are being left vulnerable, perhaps because they don't feel as though they can approach someone. You could always try talking to a friend or family member. And then the helpline that I just mentioned, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that also looks like a good avenue, especially if you just want to talk about what's happening in your head.
Laura, we're going to leave it there, but you've raised some great points, and people who feel like they need some help should reach out because the health is there. For all the latest science-based health news and information, your one-stop source is your prescription for health, RX411.com. That'll do it for us. Until next time, I'm Mark Huffman, hoping there are some bright spots in your January.
And I'm Laura McKeever, reminding you that the Dark Ages were followed by the Renaissance.
Yeah, good point. So long, everybody.